Welcome back. Armageddon 2419 AD, Chapter 3. Life in the 25th Century. We were delayed in starting for quite a while since I had to acquire a few crude ideas about the technique of using these belts. I had been sitting down, for instance, with the belt strapped about me, enjoying an ease similar to that of a comfortable armchair. When I stood up with a natural exertion of muscular effort, I shot 10 feet into the air with a wild, instinctive thrashing of arms and legs that amused Wilma greatly. But after some practice, I began to get the trick of gauging muscular effort to a minimum of vertical and a maximum of horizontal. The correct form, I found, was in a measure comparable to that of skating. I found also that in forest work, particularly, the arms and hands could be used to great advantage in swinging along from branch to branch, so prolonging leaps almost indefinitely at times. In going up the side of the mountain, I found that my 20th century muscles did have an advantage in spite of lack of skill with the belt. And since the slopes were very sharp and most of our leaps were upward, I could have distanced Wilma easily. But when we crossed the ridge and descended, she outstripped me with her superior technique. Choosing the steepest slopes, she would crouch in the top of a tree and propel herself outward, literally diving until, with the loss of horizontal momentum, she would assume a more upright position and float downward. In this manner, she would sometimes cover as much as a quarter of a mile in a single leap, while I leaped and scrambled clumsily behind, thoroughly enjoying the novel sensation. Halfway down the mountain, we saw another green clad figure leap out above the treetops toward us. The three of us perched on an outcropping of rock from which a view for many miles around could be had, while Wilma hastily explained her adventure and my presence to her fellow guard, whose name was Allen. I learned later that this was the modern form of Helen. You want to report by phone then, don't you? Allen took a compact packet about 6 inches square from a holster attached to her belt and handed it to Wilma. So far as I could see, it had no special receiver for the ear. Wilma merely threw back a lid as though she were opening a book and began to talk. The voice that came back from the machine was as audible as her own. She was queried closely as to the attack upon her, and at considerable length as to myself, and I could tell from the tone of that voice that its owner was not prepared to take me at my face value as readily as Wilma had. For that matter, neither was the other girl. I could realize it from the suspicious glances she threw my way when she thought my attention was elsewhere, and the manner in which her hand hovered constantly near her gun holster. Wilma was ordered to bring me in at once, and informed that another scout would take her place on the other side of the mountain. So she closed down the lid of the phone and handed it back to Ullen, who seemed relieved to see us departing over the treetops in the direction of the camps. We had covered perhaps 10 miles in what still seemed to me a surprisingly easy fashion, when Wilma explained that from here on we would have to keep on to the ground. We were nearing the camps, she said, and there was always the possibility that some small Han scout ship, invisible high in the sky, might catch sight of us through a projectoscope and thus find the general location of the camps. Wilma took me to the scout office, which proved to be a small building of irregular shape, conforming to the trees around it, and substantially constructed of green, sheet like material. I was received by the assistant scout boss, who reported my arrival at once to the historical office and two officials he called the psycho boss and the history boss, who came in a few minutes later. The attitude of all three men was at first polite but skeptical, and Wilma's ardent advocacy seemed to amuse them secretly. For the next 2 hours, I talked, explained, and answered questions. I had to explain in detail the manner of my life in the 20th century and my understanding of customs, habits, business, science, and the history of that period, and about developments in the centuries that had elapsed. Had I been in a classroom, I would have come through the examination with a very poor mark, for I was unable to give any answer to fully half of their questions. But before long, I realized that the majority of these questions were designed as traps, objects of whose purpose I knew nothing, were casually handed to me, and I was watched keenly as I handled them. In the end, I could see both amazement and belief begin to show in the faces of my inquisitors, and at last, the historical and psycho bosses agreed openly that they could find no flaw in my story or reactions, and that, unbelievable as it seemed, my story must be accepted as genuine. They took me at once to Big Boss Hart. He was a portly man with a poker face. He would probably have been the successful politician even in the 20th century. They gave him a brief outline of my story and a report of their examination of me. He made no comment other than to nod his acceptance of it. Then he turned to me. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Do we look funny to you?" "A bit strange," I admitted, "but I'm beginning to lose that dazed feeling, though I can see I have an awful lot to learn." "Maybe we can learn some things from you, too," he said. "So you fought in the First World War. Do you know we have very little left in the way of records of the details of that war? That is, the precise conditions under which it was fought and the tactics employed. We forgot many things during the Han Terror, and, well, I think you might have a lot of ideas worth thinking over for our raid masters. By the way, now that you're here and can't go back to your own century, so to speak, what do you want to do? You're welcome to become one of us, or perhaps you'd just like to visit with us for a while and then look around among the other gangs. Maybe you'd like some of the others better. Don't make up your mind now. We'll put you down as an exchange for a while. Let's see. You and Bill Hearn ought to get along well together. He's camp boss of number 34 when he isn't acting as raid boss or scout boss. There's a vacancy in his camp. Stay with him and think things over as long as you want to. As soon as you make up your mind to anything, let me know." We all shook hands, for that was one custom that had not died out in 500 years, and I set out with Bill Hearn. Bill, like all the others, was clad in green. He was a big man, that is, he was about my own height, 5 foot 11. This was considerably above the average now, for the race had lost something in stature, it seemed, through the vicissitudes of 5 centuries. Most of the women were a bit below 5 feet, and the men only a trifle above this height. For a period of 2 weeks, Bill was to confine himself to camp duty, so I had a good chance to familiarize myself with the community life. It was not easy. There were so many marvels to absorb. I never ceased to wonder at the strange combination of rustic social life and feverish industrial activity. At least, it was strange to me, for in my experience, industrial development meant crowded cities, tenements, paved streets, profusion of vehicles, noise, hurrying men and women with strained or dull faces, vast structures, and ornate public works. Here, however, was rustic simplicity, apparently isolated families and groups living in the heart of the forest, with a quarter of a mile or more between households, a total absence of crowds, no means of conveyance other than the belts called jumpers, almost constantly worn by everybody, and an occasional rocket ship used only for longer journeys, and underground plants or factories that were, to my mind, more like laboratories and engine rooms. Many of them were excavations as deep as mines. With well finished, lighted, and comfortable interiors, these people were adepts at camouflage against air observation. Not only would their activity have been unsuspected by an airship passing over the center of the community, but even by an enemy who might happen to drop through the screen of the upper branches to the floor of the forest. The camps or household structures were all irregular in shape and of colors that blended with the great trees among which they were hidden.